Peace. Islam. Sheekamauga Alamassee-El. Coming at y'all live. Deep down. Alamassee Arabian country. Coming at y'all live from Alabama district. So-called Birmingham, so-called Alabama. And, also known as the Magic City. Now, before we get into the main topic of this drop, just some quick wisdom on the history of so-called Birmingham. If you do research on Birmingham, it'll tell you that in Birmingham, well, the official history as far as Birmingham, all it says is Birmingham was incorporated as a city in 1871. So if that's all the history they have, if you look for history of so-called the area of Birmingham prior to 1871, you don't really find much. You know what I'm saying? So that right there tells you, because again, Birmingham, we all know Birmingham is an old Morris, Mississippian town. I mean, it's in so-called Alabama district, or Alabama. So we know that Alabama, the territory currently called Alabama, was part of the old Miccosukee Creek Confederacy. You know what I'm saying? And we already know that that's Muslim turf. So we know that so-called Birmingham is an old Moorish Muslim town. And the fact that you can't really find any history prior to 1871 of Birmingham, or so-called Birmingham, it just lets you know that a certain class of people were really not allowed into the South, into the Confederacy. You know, they were not allowed to come in large numbers to this deep in the South until after the Confederacy fell. You know what I'm saying? And Birmingham is known for its steel industry, its iron industry, a lot of the the limestone, everything. It's a lot of heavy mining, a huge industry of Birmingham over the years. So if they just incorporated it in 1871, how were they able to build all these great grand industries all in Birmingham? I mean, come on, man. You know what I'm saying? And again, they don't give you any history before that. And then one little note I read as far as the research on the history of Birmingham, whoever was writing the official history, they said it is thought that Birmingham was planned to be a city that was gonna thrive on non-unionized labor of so-called, I guess, African Americans or whatever. But why would they use language like that where they said it is thought that Birmingham was planned to be a non-unionized city as far as labor, so it could industrialize? That just goes to show that these people don't know. They weren't allowed in this turf like that because this is old Muslim turf. You know what I'm saying? Even after a lot of the land cessions, the same people still controlled the majority of this turf. You know what I'm saying? So these people were just trickling in. And even if they were down here, they were still under a lot of the jurisdiction of the old nobles, all the way up into the Civil War, especially in the Deep South. So that's just interesting history. Again, they say that Birmingham was incorporated in 1871. There's not a lot of official history prior to that. That means this is an old Muslim town that had these steel and these industries and these mining industries already. Again, they were just under noble titles. They weren't industrial. So when they were able to come, when the Confederacy fell, and they were able to get these charters and incorporate this city, the titles to a lot of these industries and this technology was ceded over to the United States, and they were able to create all these companies and industrialize everything. It's just really that simple. And again, if you just read through the lines, you actually do the research on some of these places, they'll tell you the history. You know what I'm saying? But just a little bit of knowledge on Birmingham. The main topic of this drop, just wanted to talk about. The main topic of this drop is we do a lot of knowledge as far as what was going on in the South and the Muslim history of the South and everything. But wanted to just do a little quick tap in about what was going on up in the Midwest. Ohio country, Illinois country, so-called Indiana, Wisconsin, that area. Because again, that was Morocco. Everything west, when the United States was first formed, around when it was official, like around 1783. Still, everything west of the Appalachian Mountains was still considered Morocco, and Muslim law was still running everything. All in Ohio country, all in so-called Indiana, all in Illinois. This was still Muslim country. You know what I'm saying? So if you do the knowledge to the history of so-called slavery in Ohio country, in Indiana, in Illinois, in that area, they're going to tell you that so-called slavery was allegedly outlawed in 1816. And now, if you've been paying attention to a lot of the drops we understand that at the end of the War of 1812, and if you understand, if you research the history of U.S. diplomacy with with Morocco and U.S. extraterritorial jurisdiction in Morocco, you'll know that in 1816, a lot of the new treaties were imposed on a lot of the Barbary states. And we understand the Barbary states, again, in a lot of the history, they like to act like the Barbary states were over there in North Africa. But as far as the United States dealing with Morocco and the Barbary states, we've already broke it down and did the knowledge, and we have the understanding that the Barbary states were right here in America. They were in the South, in the Midwest. Everything west of the Appalachian Mountains was considered the Barbary states. You know what I'm saying? As far as the United States was concerned, right? Initially after the Revolutionary War. Okay, so if all these new treaties were imposed on the Barbary states in 1816, and if you do the research on so-called slavery in the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois territory, it'll tell you that slavery was officially outlawed in 1816 in Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. Coincidence? I think not. So let's just do the knowledge to that. Okay. So, and one thing we want to start to drive home is that when you do the research on a lot of these things, when you do research on a lot of these topics as far as slavery and everything, they're always going to talk about the so-called free blacks, the free blacks, and how they were running up north and taking the Underground Railroad and trying to escape, and they couldn't catch a break or anything like that. Now one of the biggest plays they done ran on our people over the years is after the Civil War and the whole reconstructed history, they kind of did the Jacob and Esau switch on us. There is a history of slavery. There is a history of people in as far as pre-Civil War America, like the antebellum era and all of that, all the way back to the colonies. There is a history of so-called slavery, and people being put in bondage, and people, just being arrested for being trespassers and all, and just being taken captive and ransomed off and all type of stuff. But the thing is, the big play is the people who were so-called being treated bad and being so-called enslaved, in prison, put in bondage, and all of these things, they were not the Mississippian people. You know what I'm saying? It was not us. That culture, that whole demonstration, that understanding, that was put on us after the Civil War, because they needed to disassociate a lot of our minds from the land beneath our feet, because they understood it in order to industrialize this nation, a so-called Morocco, or what's called United States now, but it's really Morocco. In order to industrialize the land, they needed to retrain the youth at the time, especially after the Civil War, because they had a lot of people in re-education schools and stuff like that. They needed to disassociate a lot of the heirs, because again, our people still had a lot of allodial titles and noble titles. And again, we've already done the knowledge to a lot of the lynching and the ill treatment around the Jim Crow era was just a military campaign to kill or dismember or get anybody who wanted to hold up an allodial title to any technology, any large tracts of land, or anything. You know what I'm saying? If you didn't want to give that up and put it under so-called trusteeship of the United States, they was coming after you. They was sending the goons after you. So that's what a lot of the lynching and the killing was going on. The race riots, so-called race riots and all that stuff, all through the Jim Crow era. That's what that was about. It was about going against the old nobles and the old landowners and getting them out the way for industrialization. That's all it was. So, again, we want to understand, because the Mississippians, the minds of the Mississippians, of the real Mississippians who give a damn, they need to be reorientated to who they really are going forward, because you got way too many doppelgangers and people who want to be replacements of our people, who have been trying to pretend to be us ever since Reconstruction. You know what I'm saying? So when they talk about the slave owners and the slave masters and all these people and all the people that was like the big dogs in the old America prior to the Civil War, now you got these doppelgangers and these other people pretending like that was them. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you read the history books, they got these lighter skinned people and all these foreigners and immigrants trying to pretend like they was us. But in reality, we were the ones running everything in old America. We was the slave. We was bagging people up. We was arresting people. We was putting people on plantations. The Mississippian people, it wasn't them. You know what I'm saying? All this pretending, birthright theft and stealing, that's out the way. That's about to be out the way. Going forward, we getting back to our rightful state. So all the pretenders, all this pretending and all that's just really not gonna fly no more. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, just doing the knowledge to that. Now, when they're talking about the so-called free blacks, all of these people, now that demonstration did exist, and it also existed for the so-called lighter skinned, Caucasoid looking Christians. These people, again, it wasn't necessarily about color or anything like that. It was more so about the religion you chose and whatever, and just your culture. You know what I'm saying? Because in old America, it was a noble culture. So the nobles had the titles and the blood rights and the blood titles to everything. The royal Muslims, the noble Muslims, who was blood in, and the Israelite nobles. They might have called them the French or the British nobles or whatever. These are European family. You know what I'm saying? These are the people who had all of the titles and were running everything in old America, pre-United States America. It just is what it is. So, and we weren't too friendly to all of these, we weren't too friendly to the peasants. We kept a line, a red line between nobility and peasant. You know what I'm saying? Because we dealt with a lot of the Old Testament culture. So we didn't really believe in watering down the blood or anything like that. It just is, I'm not saying right or wrong, but it is what it is. You had to show and prove to marry into a noble family or deal with our people like that. You know what I'm saying? There was a hierarchy. You want to call it a caste system? It is what it is. You know what I'm saying? So that's how it was in old America. So you had this new school, New Testament Christian demonstration. There was kind of pervasive coming through Europe, and it took effect kind of on the colonies, mainly in the Northeast. Mainly in the Northeast. Because the rest of the country didn't really deal with that. That's really a big reason why, to this day, you wonder why a lot of New Yorkers are hated by the rest of the country. You know what I'm saying? Like this, like New Yorkers, just generally, and again, we got a lot of our people that are Upper East Coast and all these people, but generally, people from New York generally don't get a lot of love in the rest of the country, and there's a reason for that. But a lot of the incoming peasant demonstration, or talking about equality and blurring the lines between nobility and peasant, that whole New Testament Christianity demonstration, that was not like if you left the colonies, or if you went west of the Appalachian mountains with that demonstration, you literally were going to get arrested, seized, ransomed, or you were going to get treated as a second or third class citizen. You know what I'm saying? Because we didn't allow these new school Christians. They had no rights in Morocco. They had no rights outside of the colonies or west of the Appalachian Mountains. It just is what it is. You know what I'm saying? So when they're talking about these blacks or these people who got treated really, really bad, the majority of these people were not us. They had nothing to do with us. But what they wanted to do was, after the Civil War, they wanted to come up with this color caste system to throw us off. So they wanted to give us a whole foreign group of people's culture. Yeah, you did have a lot of these people may have been from the Caribbean. You might have had Mississippian people who might have gave up their nobility and they wanted to be United States citizens. You know what I'm saying? And they got put. They lost their nobility. You know what I'm saying? But a lot of these people were not from here. So when they came here, they came here to work. This is how you really need to think of it when they're talking about the free blacks and the free slaves and all these people who got treated so bad in old America. This is how you need to think of it. To this day, if you see it, you may be in your neighborhood or whatever, and you may run into a so-called African immigrant or something like that. Now, you understand that this African immigrant, even though he may be a worker, he may drive Uber, or he may have a business in your community, but this immigrant, he has to follow a whole set of guidelines in order to maintain his green card, or in order to be able to stay here. And that's all the immigrants really, but I'm just putting in the context when they're talking about these free blacks and these so-called black slaves and all these indentures and all these people. Because essentially, these people first came here under the jurisdiction of the crown. But we were the noble Muslims. We were already here. We were free in our own land. The way we are now is how we've always been here. Nobody put us in chains and mass enslavement. We were the bosses. You know what I'm saying? Like the Mississippian people were the noble Muslims. We lived under Sharifian law. You couldn't tell us nothing in this land. You know what I'm saying? Because this is Morocco. Believe that. But a lot of these people, like you might have had an African Christian coming from the Congo, and he came here under the crown or something like that. He might have been caught in war with the Spanish or something like that, and he had to come here and work in indenture, or he was put to hard labor. These were the people. They were slaves. They were not us. You know what I'm saying? So again, think about it. An African, you may be in your community, you're Mississippian, right? And you see an African immigrant in your community to this day. That African immigrant, he may be from Ghana or Gambia or whatever he may come from. He has to follow strict guidelines. There's only so much he can do because he is employed. He's literally an employee of the United States. there's only so much he can do or he will get deported. You know what I'm saying? Like, he has to follow strict guidelines. So when that's exactly what was going on back in the day. So when you're talking about all these freed slaves and these people who had to, these were mainly immigrants who were indentures they were either under jurisdiction of the crown or they might have been United States citizens. But we the free Muslims, so we would see these people and we were already free. So they might have got treated bad in their demonstration, or they might have moved into a Mississippian city or something like that, and we might have knocked them upside the head like we don't want these people here. That type of stuff was happening. So they'll say there was an interesting story in Ohio, because we're gonna talk about how enslavement of Christians was outlawed in Ohio country and in Illinois and Indiana in 1816. But I read, just doing the knowledge, I read an article about in Cincinnati around 1829. Because we all know that Cincinnati is an old Moorish town. I mean, let's just keep it a buck. I mean, old Ohio country. Settlers didn't really get deep into Ohio country until the 1820s and the 1830s. So Cincinnati's an old Moorish town. So they said around the time of 1829, the so-called Negro population. Now, when they're talking about Negroes, they're talking about Negro Christians. They're not talking about the Muslims. The Muslims, you couldn't tell a Muslim nothing back then, because we live under different laws. We're Moroccans. We're under the jurisdiction of Morocco. It's always been that way. So you've always been free. Most of us have always been free. Nobody can tell us nothing. This is our land. But they talked about how they had a growing so-called Negro population in Cincinnati. But Cincinnati was majority Mississippian. So they said that the so-called whites in Cincinnati, this is 1829. There's not a lot of settlers in Cincinnati in 1829. Don't get it messed up. They were not there like that. You know what I'm saying? So who was in Cincinnati? So they said the so-called whites were running into the Negro neighborhoods and beating up the Negroes. You know what I'm saying? In Cincinnati in 1829. And then they had to move to Canada. You know what I'm saying? A lot of them had to leave and move to Canada. What was really going on was the Mississippians in Cincinnati did not want all these immigrants in their neighborhood. It's no different than what's going on in Chicago right now. The indigenous people of Chicago, the real Chicago, the Mississippians in Chicago are complaining that they are busting all these immigrants up there, like from all these immigrants and running them into their neighborhoods. They complaining right now, and they acting a damn fool. They going to city council meetings tearing it up right now up in Chicago, right now, because all these immigrants are coming. That was going on back then. You know what I'm saying? So in Cincinnati in 1829, the Mississippians in Cincinnati, they're going to call them whites because they was Muslims. You know what I'm saying? Muslims were at the top of society back in those days. You know what I mean? So the Muslims was running into these are the new Negro Christian immigrants coming in. They had no rights. The Muslims, the so-called whites were the Muslims in Cincinnati, and they was beating these folks up, and they had to move to Canada. You know what I'm saying? Now, who lives in Canada right now? There's not a lot of Mississippians that lives in Canada right now. But the so-called melanated people in Canada, who are they? You know what I'm saying? What nations and stuff do they come from? In Canada right now. There you go, right there. That's who that was. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, I don't even need to say where they're from, because everybody who knows anything about Canada knows the type of so-called the Negroid people that's in Canada right now. You already know where they come from. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, now, just wanted to do the knowledge to, when they're talking about free blacks and so-called black slaves, that's not the Mississippians, because the Mississippians was Muslims. We had our own customs. They can't write our history because they don't know it. Our jurisdiction was under Sharifan law. You know what I'm saying? We had our own towns. We had our own demonstration. They can't tell you about your history because they don't know what it was. They couldn't come around you like that. Just get that out the paint. So they can't talk about some free black Negroes. These was not us. These were some other folks, some other immigrant people, just like they are now. There's no difference. It's always been going on. It's just back in those days we could enforce laws back then. Now the United States is pretty much enforcing all these laws and all that stuff. You know what I'm saying? And protecting a lot of the people coming in. It is what it is. So now we understand that at the end of the Revolutionary War, the United States signed a treaty of peace and friendship with the Sultan of Morocco. And we already done the knowledge in the old drop how the Sultan of Morocco was stationed he was based in Chicago. So the Sultan of Morocco, again, they signed the treaty of peace and friendship in 1787 with the Sultan of Morocco, because again, the United States had to, they needed protection for their ships. They needed protection of their commercial vessels and all that, all through the interior of this country. You know what I'm saying? So again, the Barbary states that they had to do these treaties with were in America. They were not over there in North Africa. That was just a satellite. So anything they did over there, anything that went on in North Africa, the treaties that were signed here were in effect there as well. But it had to be signed here because the Barbary states were headquartered here, not in North Africa. Let's just keep it a buck. So the United States signed a Treaty of Peace and Friendship in 1787, the Moroccan Treaty. Now, magically that same year, right, the United States comes out with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, what the Northwest Ordinance essentially did was it was supposed to govern any United States citizens, the new settlers that were moving west of the Appalachian Mountains, because, again, United States has some extraterritorial rights through the Moroccan Treaty. You know what I'm saying? And it even said that Thomas Jefferson, he was one of the main proponents of the Northwest Ordinance, and because he really wanted to abolish slavery in Ohio country and everything like that. And we're gonna get into that in a second. But it said that Thomas Jefferson, he proposed this ordinance in 1784, but they rejected it in Congress. You know what I'm saying? But all of a sudden they pushed it forward in 1787. The reason why was because they had to get permission from the Sultan. They had to sign this. They had to sign the Treaty of Peace and Friendship in order to pass the Northwest Ordinance to govern the United States citizens' movements into the interior of the country. You know what I'm saying? Because again, the interior of the country was Morocco. Now, one of the main articles or laws as far as the Northwest Ordinance, because the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had nothing to do with the Moroccans that were already in so-called Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois, Wisconsin right now. You know what I'm saying? The same Mississippian people who were there who were there back then are there now. You know what I'm saying? So it had nothing to do with us because we were Moroccan. We had our own laws, our own Sharifan laws and customs in these places. So the Northwest Ordinance was supposed to govern the United States citizens. Now, one of the key tenets of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was it allegedly abolished slavery. You know what I'm saying? But it also said that anybody who was already enslaved in the so-called Northwest Territory, which was Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and all that, they had to remain in servitude. So what went on was, again, we've already discussed how over the period of the colonies, period of the history of the colonies, you had so many so-called settlers or colonial workers and people running west, leaving the colonies and getting arrested and bagged up and taken in and all that over the years. Now, when these people left these colonies, they were under, the interior of this country was under Sharifan Muslim law because it was Morocco. And the only other people that was really rocking like that were the French, our French Yahudi homies. You know what I'm saying? They had their own jurisdiction, they had their own thing, but the majority was Morocco. So most of the towns in so-called Ohio, all through the South, they were Muslim towns dealing with Muslim Barbary Sharifan law. You know what I'm saying? That's just what was going on. So, so they passed the Northwest Ordinance. Again, it so-called prohibited slavery, but these people were running away. So they were running into Ohio country for a long time prior to the Revolutionary War and everything. They were running into Illinois. They were running, but they were getting bagged up. So they had to come into our towns, and they had to pretty much take orders from us. They were considered enslaved. If they didn't get killed or they didn't get put to hard labor, they didn't get sold and ransomed into slavery or whatever we chose to do with them, they didn't. They were under our jurisdiction. You know what I'm saying? And the so-called United States couldn't do nothing about it. Okay, so it said that the Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery, so-called prohibited slavery. Now, interestingly enough, it said that Thomas Jefferson allegedly owned slaves. We don't know, you know what I'm saying? We don't know, because Thomas Jefferson was a mixed man. He wasn't like the whitewashed version that they put out there. But they said that he owned slaves, but he was an abolitionist. You know what I'm saying? He was an abolitionist who supported the ordinance, and he wanted to outlaw slavery in the Midwest, in the Northwest Territory. Now ask yourself this: why would Thomas Jefferson be a slave owner, but he would be an abolitionist at the same time? But he allegedly owned slaves. You know what I'm saying? The reason why is because, again, when they talk about abolitionists and abolition and all that back in those days, and these people who were anti-slavery, again, we get a rewritten history that's written in code. These abolitionists, these people who are more so on the colonies and mainly in the Northeast, from Virginia up on the Upper East Coast, the abolitionist movement, all that was an anti-Islam movement. That's all it was, because they understood that Islam governed the entire country, because the entire country was Morocco. So they wanted some protection because they knew they knew if they left, if you wasn't a noble in that culture, because the nobles, you don't get it messed up. The European nobles were not practicing this New Testament Christianity. They were more so Yahudi Hebrew, Israelite. You know what I'm saying? They were practicing a higher culture, but they had their peasant class that was practicing a different culture. Because it was, again, America was ran by nobles. It was ran by blood titles and all that. The whole world, most of the world was run that way back then. You know what I'm saying? That's what the industrialists were trying to get rid of that. So, again, when they say Thomas Jefferson, so-called Thomas Jefferson, again, and you don't get it messed up, he was like a mulatto. He wasn't you know what I'm saying? When they say he was an abolitionist, that means he was really anti-Islamic, because Islam governed the entire country. So literally, New Testament Christians had no rights under Muslim law. They had no rights. You know what I'm saying? They would let you live and rock in your culture, but you had to pay taxes. You know what I'm saying? You was like a second, third class citizen. You might get ransomed off into slavery. You had no rights, and these people hated that. You know what I'm saying? So they were like, well, and they knew the majority of their work, the industrialists and the people who were running the United States at that time, they knew they needed their settling working class to be able to move around. You know what I'm saying? Go where they needed to go. So people like Thomas Jefferson were like, at some point, we're going to have to get rid of Islam in America. You know what I'm saying? Because wherever you go in these little Moroccan towns and all these Muslim towns and all that stuff, when they see these settlers and these people, they're gonna bag them up, they're gonna arrest them, and they're gonna ransom them off, they're gonna snatch them up, because under Barbary law, these people have no rights. So when they're talking about abolitionists, anytime you hear in any history books you're talking about an abolitionist, they're talking about they want Islam up out of here. Because remember, understand, America, the old Al-Moroccan Empire was Muslim. You know what I'm saying? We really got to drive that home. The old empire, American Al-Moroccan Empire, was Muslim. Most of the Mississippians were Muslims. That's why we were not slaves. We had our own jurisdiction. And if you came to a Muslim town with this New Testament Christianity, you were getting put in bondage. That's just how it was. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, now let's move on. Now, interestingly enough, now we've talked about how the War of 1812 and everything. It does say, if you do the history of slavery in Ohio and Indiana and all these places, it says that slavery was not really outlawed until 1816. Let's say that again. Slavery was not really outlawed in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois until 1816. Okay? Now, what else happened in 1816? We've already done the knowledge in the old drop of how all these treaties got imposed after the War of 1812, which was really the Barbary Wars in America, where the United States was fighting with the Barbary powers. You know what I'm saying? Because essentially, we just had such a civil disagreement that a lot of our people, a lot of the Moors of America, were really trying to shut the United States down. They got tired of it. You know what I'm saying? They really was not allowed. The real Moors and most of the Moors in the interior of the country, they thought it was okay in the beginning, but they were like, no, we don't want these new peasant type of people moving in our turf. They're not like us. We only like to deal with nobles. So they tried to do a ditch effort really to destroy the United States. They'll call it Great Britain and everything, but the War of 1812 was really the Moors, the Barbary Moors of America, really trying to shut down the United States. Of course, it didn't work because you had so many turncoats and everything. But after the War of 1812, when the United States kind of got a military advantage over a lot of the Barbary states, they said they imposed new treaties on the Barbary states, on Tunis, Tripoli, and evidently up in Ohio too. So slavery was officially outlawed in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois country in 1816. Coincidence? I think not. You know what I'm saying? And they said in the 1816 so-called Constitution of Indiana, because Indiana became a state in 1816. Coincidence? I think not. You know what I'm saying? That basically means the Muslim law was not really governing that territory after around the time of 1816. And we've already done the knowledge to how you had so many Mississippians after the War of 1812. The United States was able to get extraterritorial jurisdiction over their citizens completely after 1816. And we always talked about how a lot of Mississippians started switching sides and wanting to become United States citizens, because what was going on was you got a lot of these people who I guess they got tired of their own strict Muslim culture. You know what I'm saying? So it happens to this day. You got a lot of people who just, they want to relax. They don't want to be so hardcore and all that stuff. So you got a lot of people who are just wanting to become United States citizens. So once they had a certain amount of people, mainly the Mississippian people, they were creating all these new states. So it's no accident that Indiana becomes a state in 1816 and Illinois becomes a state in 1818, and slavery was outlawed in these places. Because prior to the War of 1812, Christians in Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana and Wisconsin, they were being enslaved. You know what I'm saying? They were not freeing no black slaves. They were not freeing our people with these anti-slavery laws in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois and all of that. They were freeing the Christians, because don't get it messed up. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Missouri, and all that, that's old Muslim. Those are old Muslim. Those old Muslim territory. So for the longest time, through the whole entire history of the so-called colonies and everything, if so-called Christians were to go into that area, they would get arrested and seized. You know what I'm saying? So that's what the slavery was about. That's what abolition is about. It's about shutting down Islam because they got tired. They don't want us arresting these settlers. That's all it was. You know what I'm saying? So slavery was going on all over this country. You know what I'm saying? It is what it is. But the slavery was not of the Mississippian people, because the Mississippians were Muslim. We were under Muslim law. We had the power. We were enslaving the Christians. You know what I'm saying? And you can read plenty of books on the Barbary slavery and all that, and they'll tell you. But all the books you're going to read about Christian slavery in the Barbary states is going to act like it was all going on in North Africa. But really and truthfully, even though it was going on over there as well, it was going on right here in America, in the majority of America. So who was the slaves? You know what I'm saying? So again, slavery was outlawed by the 1816 Indiana Constitution. Slavery was outlawed in Illinois in 1818. Also outlawed in Ohio, 1816. It was after the War of 1812. They were basically getting getting the upper hand over the Barbary states because we had snatched up so many Christians. You know what I'm saying? Over the years and all that, and we had put them in chains. Now, one interesting, and I'm just gonna give you we're gonna go over a real story to back that up on what was really going on in so-called Ohio country and all of that. Because again, Christians, New Testament Christians had no rights in the old states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, all these places. They had no rights because Muslim law governed these places until the War of 1812. You know what I'm saying? So check it out. Now we've already talked about in the old drop. We talked about Sheik Pontiac. He was of the Ottawa and the Salt. You know what I'm saying? Sheik Pontiac, a Mississippian Muslim. You know what I'm saying? He engaged in Pontiac's war against the so-called British, I believe in the 1860s or something like that. But we're gonna do there's a story about something that happened in so-called Sheik Pontiac's village in 1767, and this was going on all over the Midwest and all over the South. Don't get it messed up. But there was a so-called Christian girl who was a captive in Pontiac's village in 1767, and we're gonna do the knowledge to what happened with that story and how what was really going down with so-called slavery in the Midwest territories. So check it out. So let's do the knowledge real quick. Okay. Now the little girl's name was Elizabeth Betty Fisher. So it says, just doing the knowledge to this story, Sheik Pontiac. He was a part of the Ottawa. He was a part of the Ottawa, so-called Ottawa tribe. But all that is just a district. You know, the old Barbary states, they had different districts and all that. If you came from a certain district, they would just call you a tribe in this new reconstructed history. But Pontiac was part of the Ottawa. He was part of the Sauk and Illinois Confederacy and all that stuff. That was his whole demonstration. So Sheik Pontiac Pontiac was summoned to Detroit in 1767 to testify in an investigation of the murder of Elizabeth Betty Fisher, a 7-year-old English colonist. Now, in the 1763 siege of Detroit, an Ottawa war party attacked the Fisher farm, killing Betty's parents and taking the girl captive. Next year, in Pontiac's village, the girl was a captive slave. The captive girl tried to warm herself at Pontiac's fire. It said that Pontiac got mad when she soiled his clothes because she had dysentery. And Pontiac, he got mad and he threw her into the Maumee River. And he summoned one of his French speaking kinsmen to drown her in the river. Now, it said that shortly thereafter, or the next year, the following year, that French man was arrested, and he was arrested by the British colonial authorities, and he escaped shortly before his trial. But then they said that Pontiac, he was summoned down to the trial to testify, to testify in the investigation. And they said Pontiac neither confirmed nor denied his role, and the charges were dropped. So it just said that Pontiac, they took a Christian girl captive, and they had her in his village for a whole year, and he threw her into the river and killed her. And I'm not saying right or wrong, but we just spitting facts. This is what's going on. Now Pontiac was a Mississippian, looking just like yours truly. Don't get it messed up. He was a Muslim Mississippian. Now he had this Christian girl. We don't know what her demonstration. She could have been Caucasian. She could have been Negro. She could have been mixed mulatto, whatever. But he had this young Christian 7-year-old girl captive in his village for a whole year. And he killed her and threw her in the river. And then they couldn't even do nothing to him. You know what I'm saying? Like he said, I don't know. He said he confirmed or denied, and they couldn't do nothing to him. Because again, this was still Morocco. You still had to do international politics. Like it's like, if you kill it, it was kind of considered an international incident. You know what I'm saying? Because these people were under the protectorate of the British, of the so-called British authorities at the time. You know what I'm saying? But it was still Morocco, so we still had jurisdiction on most of, we still had our own thing. It ain't no different from you going into Chinatown and you got to deal with their police and their setup. You know what I'm saying? If you do something there, then you may have to go to their courts and deal with that as an international incident. This is the same situation, but they couldn't touch Pontiac. He said, I don't know if it happened or not, and they had to let him go. You know what I'm saying? Because they couldn't really deal with Moroccans like that back then. The British had no authority to do anything to this man because this was Morocco. The Mississippians had the power. And that's just one story out of a million. These people were getting taken, the Muslims was doing slave raids and taking these people captive by the thousands all over this country. You know what I'm saying? That was what was really going on. So when you hear people like Thomas Jefferson and the abolitionists talk about their anti-slavery, that's what they were talking about. They were talking about these Muslims taking these Christians captive, having them in their villages, killing them, selling them off, and all type of stuff. You know what I'm saying? That was what was really going on for the most part. And they would take so-called Caucasian Christians, and they would take so-called melanated Christians. They would anybody. You know what I'm saying? If you was not Muslim like us, or you wasn't cool with us in America, it was a free-for-all on you. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I'm saying? It was like, you just give it up. You know what I mean? We're going upside your head. It is what it is. And I'm not saying right or wrong, but that's what really was happening. So when slavery was outlawed, abolition is anti-Islam, because under Muslim Sharifian law, people who are not of a certain status, of a certain understanding, of a certain monotheistic culture, they can be enslaved. That's old Sharifian law. And it's really Old Testament law. It is what it is. That's just what was going on. So we are tired, again, we Mississippians are not going to accept that fake slave, the real Mississippians, we're not going to accept that fake slave title no more. We were I'm not saying right or wrong, but the Mississippian Muslims, we were the ones taking people captive. We were the ones putting people in, we were the ones selling people off, putting them in bondage, and demanding ransoms and all of that. That's just what was going on. It is what it is. But we're going to take our proper role. We are not going to have this slave label put on us anymore. You know what I'm saying? All of this fake Negro slavery and all that stuff, that had nothing to do with the Mississippians. We've always been the same people walking around here free with our guns and all that. You know what I'm saying? We had way more power back then. We've just been, due to losing the few wars and so many turncoats, we've kind of just been put under siege. But it is what it is, because the real ones is coming back. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. Believe that. You know what I'm saying? So just doing the knowledge. Again, Northwest Territories, slavery was outlawed 1816 after the War of 1812. That means, again, we've already talked about how the Barbary treaties were imposed on the Barbary states in 1816. So that means that, again, New School Christians could move around after 1816 into Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. It had nothing to do with no fake black slavery. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, just tapping in live, y'all. Live from Alabama. I'll tap back in with y'all.